Ex-Nazi spy handler reveals female agents harassed until they couldn't speak their own names. December 3rd, 1942. Villa Waldeck, Berchtesgaden, Bavaria. The snow falls silently on the mountains, each flake disappearing into the white expanse that surrounds the Alpine villa like a fortress of ice. Inside, the air's warm, thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of burnt coffee. A woman sits in a wooden chair in the centre of a bare room. Her name is Mathilde Carré, though she has not been called by that name in 6 days. She has been called traitor and whore and subject and a dozen other things, but not Mathilde, not the name her mother gave her. The chair has no restraints, but she does not move. Her hands rest on her thighs, palms up, fingers slightly curled. She is 29 years old. She was once beautiful, though the mirrors have been removed from this room, and she cannot remember now what her face looks like. Across from her stands Sturmbannführer Hoffmann, 42 years old, veteran of the First War, officer of the Abwehr, German military intelligence. He wears a grey suit, not a uniform. This is important. The absence of military insignia creates the illusion of civility, of a conversation rather than an interrogation. He has been trained in this work at WWII, the Abwehr's espionage school north of Berlin, where they teach the science of breaking human beings without leaving marks that cameras can capture. He has a file folder in his left hand. It contains everything: Mathilde's recruitment by French resistance, her capture by German forces in Paris 3 months ago, her subsequent turning, that clinical word the intelligence services use for the moment when a captured agent chooses collaboration over death. But something has gone wrong. Mathilde has been cooperative, has provided intelligence, has agreed to work as a double agent sending false information to London. Yet Hoffmann's superiors have ordered continued conditioning, another clinical word for systematic psychological destruction. The intelligence she provides is useful, but not sufficient. They want more. They want absolute loyalty, complete submission, the kind of devotion that only comes when a person's sense of self has been dismantled and rebuilt in the shape the Reich requires. So for 6 days, Hoffmann has been conducting what the Abwehr manual calls intensive resocialization. He has been teaching Mathilde to forget who she was. "State your name," he says in German. His voice is calm, almost gentle. This is the 14th time he has asked this question today. Mathilde opens her mouth. No sound emerges. Her lips move, forming the shape of her name, Mathilde, but her vocal cords produce nothing. The silence stretches. Hoffmann waits, patient as winter. Finally, Mathilde whispers something in a voice so broken it barely qualifies as speech. Subject 47B, her prisoner designation, not her name. Hoffmann makes a note in his file. "Good," he says, "we're making progress." This is how nations break their enemies in the shadows, not with bullets and bombs, but with rooms and words and the systematic destruction of identity. This is how the secret war is fought, not on battlefields, but in alpine villas and basement cells and safe houses where names disappear and humans become subjects, and the voice that once said "I am" learns to say only what it is told to say. The history of espionage is often romanticized. Glamorous agents, daring missions, elaborate deceptions. But the reality of intelligence work during the Second World War was frequently brutal, especially for women who found themselves caught between competing intelligence services. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence organization, operated a vast network of spies, double agents, and informants across occupied Europe. By 1942, as the war expanded and German resources stretched thin, the Abwehr increasingly relied on turned agents, captured enemy operatives who were persuaded to work for Germany instead. The process of turning an agent was not simply a matter of offering money or appealing to ideology. It required breaking the person's loyalty to their original cause, dismantling their sense of identity and purpose, rebuilding them as compliant instruments of German intelligence. The Abwehr developed sophisticated techniques for this work, drawing on emerging psychological theories about conditioning, trauma, and identity formation. These techniques were refined at training facilities like WWII and the Abwehr school at Tegel, where officers learned not just how to recruit spies, but how to psychologically dominate them. Women presented particular challenges and opportunities for intelligence handlers. In the 1940s, women were often underestimated by enemy services, making them effective covert operatives. But they were also seen as more emotionally vulnerable, more susceptible to psychological manipulation, more likely to break under sustained pressure. The Abwehr's training manuals explicitly discuss techniques for handling female agents differently from male ones, emphasizing emotional manipulation, exploitation of relationships, and attacks on personal identity and self-worth. The villa near Berchtesgaden, where Mathilde Carré found herself in December 1942, was one of several facilities the Abwehr maintained for intensive work with captured or turned agents. It was deliberately isolated, removed from military bases and urban centres, a place where screams would not be heard, and where subjects could be held for weeks or months while handlers systematically reshaped their psychology. The villa had been a private residence before the war, owned by a Jewish family who fled Germany in 1938. The Abwehr acquired it in 1940, stripped it of its original furnishings, converted its bedrooms into interrogation cells, and its library into an office where files on agents were, maintained in locked cabinets. By late 1942, the Abwehr was processing dozens of captured agents through facilities like this one. Some were foreign nationals recruited before the war who'd been exposed. Some were resistance fighters captured in occupied territories. Some were enemy intelligence officers caught during operations. The common thread was that all had information the Abwehr wanted, and all needed to be transformed from enemies into assets. The techniques used to achieve this transformation were remarkably consistent. Isolation, disorientation, sleep deprivation, constant interrogation, and a systematic assault on the subject's sense of identity. Names were particularly important. Intelligence handlers understood that a person's name is fundamental to their sense of self. It connects them to family, history, identity. One of the first steps in breaking an agent was to stop using their name, to refer to them instead by number or designation or demeaning term. Handlers would ask subjects to state their names repeatedly, then punish them for saying their real names, or reward them for using their prisoner designation. Over time, through repetition and conditioning, subjects would internalize the new designation, would hesitate when asked their real names, would eventually struggle to remember who they had been before capture. This was not crude torture. It was psychological warfare conducted with clinical precision, documented in reports, refined through practice. The Abwehr officers who conducted this work were not sadists, or at least not only sadists. They were intelligence professionals implementing techniques they had been trained to use, following protocols developed by their organization, pursuing operational objectives set by their superiors. They saw themselves as soldiers in a secret war where the battleground was the human mind and the objective was control. Sturmbannführer Karl-Heinz Hoffmann had not expected to become an expert in destroying women's identities. When he joined the Abwehr in 1935, he imagined himself conducting traditional espionage, recruiting agents, managing intelligence networks, analyzing enemy capabilities. He had a degree in psychology from the University of Heidelberg, and his initial role was as an analyst, assessing personality profiles of potential recruits. He was good at it, able to identify vulnerabilities, predict behavior, match operatives to missions. His superiors noticed his aptitude and sent him to Quenzi for advanced training in 1938. At Quenzi he learned the art and science of human manipulation. The curriculum covered everything from recruitment techniques to interrogation methods to the psychological management of long-term agents. There were lectures on behavioral conditioning, on trauma response, on the breaking points of different personality types. There were practical exercises where students practiced interrogation techniques on each other, learning to recognize signs of psychological stress, to exploit emotional vulnerabilities, to systematically dismantle a subject's resistance. Hoffmann excelled. He had a natural talent for reading people, for identifying the precise psychological pressure points that would yield compliance. He was promoted, assigned increasingly sensitive cases, eventually given responsibility for managing a network of turned agents in occupied France. By 1942, he was considered one of the Abwehr's most effective handlers, particularly skilled at working with female agents who required intensive conditioning. He told himself that what he did was necessary. Germany was fighting a war for survival against enemies who would destroy the Reich if given the chance. Intelligence work was essential to that fight. If breaking a few enemy agents produced information that saved German lives or advanced German objectives, then it was justified. This was the standard rationalization, the mental framework that allowed him to do his work without excessive guilt. He was a soldier, following orders, serving his nation. The women he broke were enemies who had chosen their side, who would have done the same to German agents if positions were reversed. But Hoffmann was intelligent enough to recognize his own rationalizations for what they were. Late at night, alone in his quarters at the villa, he sometimes allowed himself to think about what he actually did. He took women who had been brave enough to fight against Nazi occupation, who had risked their lives for their beliefs, and he systematically destroyed their sense of self until they could not remember their own names without his permission. He did not do this through physical torture. The Abwehr generally avoided leaving visible marks, but through psychological techniques that were often more damaging. Isolation, humiliation, disorientation, the relentless assault on identity and dignity that left subjects psychologically shattered, even as their bodies remained unharmed. The work required a kind of emotional numbness. Hoffmann could not afford to see his subjects as fully human, as women with families and histories and futures. He had to maintain clinical distance, had to think of them as cases, as assets, as problems to be solved. He developed techniques for this distancing, referring to subjects by number rather than name, even in his private thoughts, focusing on operational objectives rather than the human cost, avoiding eye contact during particularly brutal sessions. These techniques worked, mostly. He could conduct his interrogations with professional detachment, could implement conditioning protocols without excessive emotional involvement. But there were moments when the distance collapsed. Mathilde Carré was one of those moments. She was not the first female agent he had broken. She was perhaps the 20th. But something about her affected him differently. Maybe it was her intelligence. She had been a skilled operative for the French resistance, quick thinking and resourceful. Maybe it was her dignity. Even as he systematically dismantled her identity, she maintained a kind of interior composure that he found both admirable and frustrating. Or maybe it was simply that she reminded him, in some way he did not want to examine, of his sister who had died in 1932, before all of this, before the Reich and the war and the work that had consumed his life. On the 7th day of intensive conditioning, when Mathilde could no longer say her own name without trembling, Hoffmann left the interrogation room and went outside into the snow. He stood there for 20 minutes smoking cigarettes, watching his breath fog in the cold air. He thought about quitting, about requesting a transfer, about finding some way out of this work. Then he went back inside, returned to the interrogation room and continued the session. Because what else was there? The war was happening, the work needed to be done, and he was good at it. So he did it. What Hoffmann expected from this work was professional success, advancement within the Abwehr, recognition of his skills. What he experienced was something darker, a gradual erosion of his own humanity, a growing sense of disconnection from normal emotional experience, a creeping awareness that in breaking others he was also breaking himself. He became more efficient, more coldly effective, more skilled at psychological manipulation, but he also became more isolated, more unable to connect with people outside the context of control and domination, more haunted by the faces of women who had forgotten how to say their own names. The women who became subjects of intensive conditioning by Abwehr handlers like Hoffmann came from various backgrounds. Some were professional intelligence officers trained by British SOE or American OSS. Some were resistance fighters recruited locally in occupied territories. Some were civilians who'd been drawn into espionage through family connections or ideological commitment. What they shared was courage, the decision to actively resist Nazi occupation, to take risks that most people would never consider, to place themselves in danger for a cause they believed in. Mathilde Carré had been recruited by the French resistance in 1940, shortly after France's defeat. She was working as a nurse in Paris, witnessing daily the reality of German occupation. When a resistance organizer approached her about using her medical position to gather intelligence, about wounded German soldiers, troop movements, military preparations, she agreed immediately. She began as a courier carrying messages between resistance cells. She was good at it. Calm under pressure, able to think quickly when stopped by German patrols, skilled at maintaining cover. Within months, she was running her own small network, recruiting other women, coordinating intelligence gathering, passing information to London via clandestine radio. She operated successfully for 2 years. Then, in September 1942, she was betrayed by an informant within her network. German counterintelligence arrested her in her apartment, seized her codes and radio, confronted her with evidence of her activities. She was taken to Abwehr headquarters in Paris, where she was given a choice: execution as a spy or collaboration with German intelligence as a double agent, sending false information to London while providing genuine intelligence about other resistance networks. She chose survival. Many did. It is easy to judge from a distance, from comfort and safety, but in that moment, facing death, offered a path to life. Most people choose to live. Mathilde agreed to work for the Abwehr. She was transferred to the villa near Berchtesgaden for what her captors called training, but what was actually systematic psychological conditioning, designed to ensure her complete loyalty to her new masters. The conditioning followed established protocols. First, complete isolation. Mathilde was kept alone in a small room, allowed no contact with other prisoners, given no reading material or distraction. Guards brought food at irregular intervals, sometimes 3 times in a day, sometimes not for 2 days, to disorient her sense of time. The room had constant light. She could not distinguish day from night. This isolation period lasted 1 week, during which she saw only guards who did not speak to her. Then began the interrogation phase. Hoffmann questioned her for hours each day, sometimes 8 hours, sometimes 12, sometimes with breaks, sometimes without. The questions covered everything: her background, her family, her recruitment, her operations, her contacts. But interspersed with operational questions were personal ones designed to humiliate and disorient, about her sexuality, her relationships, her fears, her weaknesses. Hoffmann would shift without warning from professional queries about resistance networks to invasive questions about her intimate life, creating a psychological atmosphere where nothing was private, where her entire self was subject to examination and judgment. The assault on her name was central to the conditioning. Hoffmann would ask her to state her name, then interrupt her, tell her that name belonged to a traitor and a whore, that she had forfeited the right to that identity. He would make her repeat her prisoner designation, Subject 47B, dozens of times per session. When she complied, he would offer small rewards: extra food, a blanket, permission to sleep. When she resisted, when she insisted on her real name, he would withdraw these privileges, would extend the interrogation, would increase the psychological pressure. It was behavioral conditioning, punishment and reward, the systematic association of her real identity with pain and her prisoner designation with relief. The technique was devastatingly effective. Within days, Mathilde began to hesitate when asked her name. Within a week she would say Subject 47B before catching herself and correcting to Mathilde Carré. Within 2 weeks she could barely force her real name out, her voice shaking, her body showing signs of stress, elevated heart rate, sweating, trembling, when she tried to assert her true identity. By the end of 3 weeks she could not say her name at all without explicit permission from Hoffmann. Her identity had been effectively hijacked, rewired, placed under someone else's control. This was the horror at the heart of Abwehr conditioning. Not that it involved physical violence, but that it attacked the core of personhood, the fundamental sense of self that allows a human being to say, "I am." The women subjected to this treatment were not beaten into submission. They were psychologically dismantled and reconstructed as instruments of German intelligence, their identities subordinated to the operational needs of the Reich. There was an object that appeared in every conditioning session at the villa, an object that became for subjects like Mathilde a symbol of their captivity and transformation, a leather-bound notebook. Hoffmann carried this notebook to every interrogation, made notes in it constantly, observations about the subject's psychological state, responses to different techniques, progress toward compliance. The notebook represented documentation, the bureaucratic soul of the intelligence service. Every session was recorded, every response noted, every technique evaluated for effectiveness. For the women being conditioned, the notebook became something else, a symbol of their reduction from person to case study, from human being to experimental subject. They would hear the scratch of Hoffmann's pen as they struggled to answer questions, as they failed to say their names, as they complied with increasingly degrading demands. They knew that their humiliation was being documented, that their breaking was being recorded in clinical language, that their pain was data in someone's research on psychological control, survivors of Abwehr conditioning, and there were survivors, women who eventually escaped or were liberated, who lived long enough to testify about what was done to them, spoke repeatedly about the notebook in their accounts. They remembered the sound of pages turning, the sight of Hoffmann writing while they wept, the knowledge that everything about them was being catalogued and analysed. One survivor, interviewed by British intelligence after the war, said, "He wrote down everything, how long it took me to answer, what I said, how my voice sounded, whether I cried. It was worse than the questions somehow. The questions were about breaking me. The notebook was about studying how I broke. I wasn't even a person to him. I was an experiment." This was the particular obscenity of intelligence service conditioning, that it was systematic, studied, refined through practice. The Abwehr did not stumble into these techniques. They developed them deliberately, trained officers in their application, documented outcomes, improved methods based on results. The notebook represented this systematization of human destruction, the transformation of psychological torture into a professional discipline with best practices and training manuals. After the war, when Allied intelligence services captured Abwehr files, they found thousands of pages of conditioning reports. The files from the villa near Berchtesgaden alone contain detailed records on 63 female agents processed through intensive conditioning between 1940 and 1944. The reports were organised, professional, written in the neutral language of clinical observation. Subject demonstrated increased compliance after 5 days isolation, read one entry. Identity confusion evident by day 7. Subject requires prompting to recall original name, read another. Conditioning complete by day 14. Subject fully receptive to handler direction, concluded a third. These files became evidence in post-war prosecutions of intelligence officers. But unlike the trials of camp doctors and military commanders, prosecutions of intelligence handlers were complicated by the nature of their crimes. They had not killed anyone directly. They had not committed physical torture in most cases. What they had done was psychological, difficult to quantify, challenging to prosecute under existing legal frameworks. Many Abwehr officers who specialised in conditioning simply walked away after 1945, returned to civilian life, never faced legal consequences for their work. Hoffmann was one of them. He was captured by American forces in May 1945, interrogated about his intelligence work, held for 18 months while investigators decided whether to prosecute him. Ultimately, they released him. The evidence of what he had done was mostly in the form of his own reports, clinical descriptions of conditioning techniques that, while clearly abusive, did not obviously violate the laws of war as they existed in 1945. And Hoffmann, during his interrogation, presented himself as a professional intelligence officer who had followed standard practices, who had been no worse than Allied handlers who also turned enemy agents, who had simply done his duty in wartime. He returned to Germany, settled in Munich, found work as a psychologist in private practice. For 30 years, he helped patients work through trauma, depression, anxiety, the kind of therapeutic work that uses psychological knowledge to heal rather than harm. He never spoke publicly about his war service. He told his patients and colleagues only that he had been in military intelligence, nothing more specific. He married in 1950, had 2 daughters, lived quietly and respectably. He died in 1976 of a stroke, aged 76. His obituary in the Munich newspaper mentioned his distinguished career in psychology and his service to Germany during the war. It did not mention the villa near Berchtesgaden, or the women whose names he taught them to forget, or the leather-bound notebook where he documented their breaking. The notebook itself survived. It was among the Abwehr files captured by Allied forces, eventually transferred to intelligence archives in Washington and London. Researchers who have examined it note its meticulous detail, its clinical tone, its complete absence of moral reflection. Hoffmann wrote about human destruction with the same neutral professionalism that he might have used to describe a chemistry experiment. This was perhaps his most damning legacy, not that he broke women for intelligence purposes, but that he did so with such thorough emotional detachment, such complete bureaucratic professionalism, such utter inability or refusal to recognize the humanity of his subjects. Mathilde Carré survived the conditioning. In January 1943, after 6 weeks at the villa, she was deemed sufficiently reliable to be deployed as a double agent. She was sent back to Paris, given a cover story, instructed to resume contact with resistance networks while reporting their activities to German intelligence. She complied, for a time. She sent reports to her Abwehr handlers. She participated in operations against her former comrades. She lived in the peculiar hell of the double agent, trusted by neither side fully, constantly surveilled, always aware that a single mistake could mean death. But something in her had not been completely broken. Some core of identity remained intact beneath the conditioning. In August 1943, during a resistance operation that went wrong, she managed to send a coded message to London identifying herself as a turned agent and requesting extraction. British intelligence, which had suspected her loyalty for months, arranged her escape through Spain. She reached London in November 1943, was immediately arrested and interrogated by MI5, spent the remainder of the war in British custody, while intelligence services tried to determine how much damage she had caused and whether her return to Allied control was genuine or another German deception. After the war, the French government tried her for collaboration. She was convicted in 1949 and sentenced to death, though the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. She served 9 years in a French prison, was released in 1954, lived quietly in southern France until her death in 1970. She never publicly discussed her time at the villa, never described in detail what Hoffmann had done to her during those weeks of conditioning. The few times she was asked by journalists or historians, she would say only, "They took my name, that is all you need to know. They made me forget my own name." Her case became one of several that intelligence services studied after the war, trying to understand the effectiveness and limitations of psychological conditioning. The conclusion, reflected in classified reports from CIA, MI6 and KGB alike, was that such techniques were highly effective in the short term, but often unstable over longer periods. Subjects could be broken, could be made to collaborate, could even be made to internalize new identities, but the original identity rarely disappeared completely. It remained buried, waiting for circumstances that might allow it to resurface. Mathilde's eventual rebellion against her conditioning was not unusual. Many turned agents eventually found ways to resist, to reassert their original loyalty, to reclaim the names they had been taught to forget. But the psychological damage was permanent. Even women who escaped or were liberated, who reclaimed their names and rebuilt their lives, carried the trauma of conditioning for the rest of their lives. They had nightmares about interrogation rooms. They flinched at certain questions. They struggled with identity issues, with a persistent sense of fragmentation, with the feeling that the self they presented to the world was somehow constructed, conditional, subject to being taken away. They had been taught, at the most fundamental level, that their identity was not their own, that it could be controlled by others, that the simple act of saying their name was a privilege that could be granted or withdrawn. This lesson, once learned, could never be entirely unlearned. The conditioning of female agents by intelligence services was not unique to Germany. British SOE, American OSS, Soviet NKVD all developed techniques for managing agents that involved psychological pressure, manipulation of identity, exploitation of vulnerabilities. The difference was often one of degree and systematization. The Abwehr's approach was particularly methodical, particularly focused on the complete reconstruction of the subject's identity rather than mere coercion of cooperation. But the fundamental logic, that agents needed to be psychologically dominated to be reliably controlled, was common across intelligence services of the era. This was part of a broader pattern in World War II, the increasing sophistication of techniques for controlling human behavior. The war saw massive advances in propaganda, in psychological operations, in understanding how to manipulate populations and individuals. Intelligence services were at the forefront of this development, experimenting with methods of interrogation, conditioning, and psychological warfare that would influence Cold War intelligence practices and eventually filter into civilian applications in advertising, political campaigns, and behavior modification programs. The women who were subjected to Abwehr conditioning were, in a sense, test subjects in this development of psychological control techniques. Their experiences contributed to a body of knowledge about human breaking points, about the malleability of identity, about the effectiveness of various psychological pressures. This knowledge did not die with the Nazi regime. It was absorbed by intelligence services that captured Abwehr personnel and files, was refined and developed through subsequent decades, became part of the standard toolkit of espionage and counterintelligence. This is one of the uncomfortable truths about World War II intelligence work, that many of the techniques developed by Axis intelligence services were not rejected by the Allies as criminal or unethical, but were instead adopted, refined, and continued. The leather-bound notebook in which Hoffmann documented conditioning techniques was not burned as evidence of atrocity. It was studied, analysed, used as a training manual for subsequent generations of intelligence handlers. The villa near Berchtesgaden was not preserved as a memorial to the women who suffered there. It was returned to private ownership and eventually demolished. The knowledge gained from their suffering was preserved. Their individual stories were largely forgotten. April 30th, 1945. The villa near Berchtesgaden. American forces are hours away. The Abwehr has already dissolved, its personnel scattered or captured. Hoffmann has fled north with a briefcase of documents, hoping to reach territory held by German forces still fighting. The villa is empty except for one woman, a recent arrival who has not yet been evacuated or moved. She's Belgian, 26 years old, arrested for courier work with resistance networks. She's been in conditioning for 11 days. She sits in the interrogation room in the wooden chair, waiting for a handler who will never return. American soldiers find her there the next morning. She does not respond when they speak to her in English or French. She stares ahead, silent, her hands resting palms up on her thighs in the posture that has been trained into her. One soldier, a lieutenant from Philadelphia who speaks some German, tries that language. "What's your name?" he asks. She opens her mouth. No sound emerges. He asks again, more gently. She whispers, barely audible, Subject 61C. The lieutenant doesn't understand immediately. He thinks she's confused, disoriented. "No," he says, "your name, your real name." She looks at him with an expression he will remember for the rest of his life. Not fear, not relief, but a kind of blank confusion, as if he has asked her a question in a language she once knew but has now forgotten. She tries again to speak, her lips forming shapes, but no sound comes. She has been conditioned so thoroughly, so completely, that even with her captors gone, even with liberation at hand, she cannot remember what to call herself. It takes weeks of care by Allied medical personnel before she can say her name again, Elizabeth. Even then she says it hesitantly, as if seeking permission, as if the word might be taken away if she uses it without authorization. She's repatriated to Belgium in June 1945, returns to her family, tries to resume her life. But something has been permanently altered. She changes her name legally in 1947, choosing a new one, Marie, because Elizabeth has become too associated with trauma, with the experience of forgetting and the painful process of remembering. She lives under this new name until her death in 1989. Her family, asked by a historian researching Abwehr conditioning in the 1990s, confirms that she never fully recovered her sense of stable identity, that she struggled her entire life with a feeling of disconnection from her own name, her own history, her own self. There is no memorial to the women who lost their names in the psychological warfare of World War II intelligence services. There is no monument marking the villa near Berchtesgaden where Mathilde Carré and dozens of others were systematically broken and rebuilt. The leather-bound notebooks that documented their destruction remain classified in intelligence archives, accessible only to researchers with special clearance who sign agreements not to reveal certain details. The techniques developed through their suffering continue to be studied, refined, applied in modified form by intelligence services around the world, but the testimony exists scattered in classified files and war crimes, investigations and oral history archives. Women who survived spoke, when they could find the strength, about what was done to them. They described the rooms and the questions and the assault on identity. They explained how they were taught to forget their names, how they were conditioned to respond to prisoner designations, how they were psychologically dismantled and reconstructed as instruments of intelligence services. Their voices, hesitant, traumatized, but persistent, preserved the truth of what happened in places like the villa, ensured that this chapter of the Secret War would not be entirely erased from history. Mathilde Carré, in one of her rare interviews after her release from prison, was asked what she wanted people to understand about her experience. She thought for a long time before answering. Then she said, "They tell stories about spies, about glamorous agents and clever deceptions. But the reality is rooms and fear, and the day you realize you cannot remember your own name without permission. That is what espionage actually is, the theft of the self in service of the state. I collaborated, yes. I betrayed my comrades, yes. But what they do not understand is that the person who did those things was not entirely me anymore. She was something they created, something they built from the pieces of who I used to be. When I escaped, when I came back to the Allies, I was trying to find myself again. I am not sure I ever succeeded." This is the final truth of the conditioning programs run by intelligence services during World War II, that they worked. They successfully broke women, turned them into compliant assets, extracted intelligence and cooperation through psychological domination rather than physical torture. But they also revealed something about the fragility of human identity, about the capacity of systematic psychological pressure to reshape consciousness, about the vulnerability of the self to external control. The women who forgot their names under interrogation were not weak. They were normal humans subjected to techniques specifically designed to exploit fundamental aspects of human psychology: the need for social connection, the desire to avoid pain, the malleability of memory and identity under sustained pressure. The handlers who implemented these techniques were not monsters, or not only monsters. They were professionals trained in psychological manipulation, following protocols developed by their organizations, pursuing intelligence objectives set by their superiors. Most of them, like Hoffmann, walked away after the war without facing justice, integrated back into civilian society, lived out their lives carrying secrets about what they had done in rooms where no one was watching. Some, perhaps, felt guilt or regret. Most simply rationalized their actions as necessary wartime measures, as no worse than what the other side did, as the price of serving their nation in a secret conflict where normal rules did not apply. The women themselves, those who survived, carried different burdens. They carried the memory of who they had been, and the trauma of almost losing that memory completely. They carried the knowledge that the self is not as stable as we imagine, that identity can be attacked and altered and controlled. They carried the aftermath of psychological violation that left no visible scars but damaged them as profoundly as any physical wound. And they carried, often, a sense of isolation. Because how do you explain to someone who has never experienced such conditioning what it feels like to forget your own name, to have your identity hijacked, to be rebuilt as someone else's instrument? There is a question that haunts the history of World War II intelligence operations, a question that survivors asked, and that historians struggle to answer satisfactorily. What is lost when a person loses their name? In practical terms, nothing. A name is just a word, an arbitrary label. But names are how we organize our sense of self, how we connect to family and history, how we assert our existence as distinct individuals. To lose your name is to lose the linguistic anchor of identity, to be cast adrift in a fundamental way. The women who were conditioned by Abwehr handlers experienced this loss literally. They were taught to forget what to call themselves, how to assert their identity, who they had been before capture. This was not accidental or incidental to intelligence work. It was a deliberate technique based on psychological understanding that identity is constructed and maintained through language, through the repeated assertion of who we are. Take away the ability to name oneself, and you begin to dismantle the self itself. This understanding, that identity is vulnerable, that consciousness can be manipulated, that the self is less solid than we believe, was one of the darker discoveries of 20th century psychology. It had applications far beyond intelligence work. It informed advertising, political propaganda, behavioral modification programs, cult indoctrination techniques. The knowledge gained from breaking women in Alpine villas filtered out into broader society, became part of the toolkit of anyone seeking to influence or control human behavior. But the women themselves, Mathilde and Elizabeth and the dozens of others whose names appear only in classified files, were not abstractions or case studies. They were humans who chose to fight against tyranny, who risked their lives for resistance movements, who demonstrated courage that most people never need to find in themselves. They were targeted for breaking precisely because they were strong, because agents who could withstand physical hardship and danger were valuable assets if they could be turned, because their intelligence and determination made them useful to the Reich if those qualities could be redirected. The conditioning they underwent succeeded in extracting their cooperation, at least temporarily. But it failed in a deeper sense, because most of these women eventually found ways to resist, to reclaim something of who they had been, to reassert their original identities and loyalties. The self, it turns out, is more resilient than intelligence handlers believed. It can be suppressed, fragmented, temporarily overwritten, but it rarely disappears completely. There remains some core of identity that persists even through systematic psychological assault, some fundamental sense of I am that waits for the pressure to release so it can reconstitute itself. This resilience is what we must remember. Not just that these women were broken, but that many of them eventually unbroke themselves, that they found their names again, that they survived not just the war but the psychological destruction that was supposed to eliminate who they were. Their survival was not always complete or clean. Many struggled with psychological damage for the rest of their lives, but they survived as themselves, not as the reconstructed instruments their handlers tried to create. The villa near Berchtesgaden is gone now, demolished in the 1960s, replaced by a private residence whose occupants probably do not know what happened on that land decades ago. The interrogation rooms and the wooden chair, and the smell of cigarette smoke and burnt coffee exist now only in testimony and documents. The leather-bound notebook remains in an archive, its pages filling with meaning only when researchers request it and read Hoffmann's clinical observations about human breaking points. But the names remain. Mathilde Carré, Elisabeth, who became Marie. The 63 women processed through that facility between 1940 and 1944, each of whom had a name that someone tried to take from her. These names, preserved in records and testimony, are small acts of resistance against the machinery of intelligence operations that sought to erase individual identity in service of state objectives. To say their names now, to remember that they existed as specific humans with specific stories, rather than as generic victims or abstract case studies, is to reject the logic of the conditioning programs that tried to convince them they were merely subjects and numbers and designations. In the end, the secret war fought in rooms and through psychological techniques reveals a truth about human consciousness, that we are simultaneously more fragile and more resilient than we imagine. We can be broken. Identity is not invulnerable. Consciousness can be manipulated. The self can be fragmented under sufficient pressure. But we can also recover, can reassemble ourselves from the pieces, can find our names again even after being taught to forget them. This capacity for recovery, for persistence of identity despite systematic assault, is perhaps the deepest form of resistance, not the dramatic action of sabotage or combat, but the quiet insistence on remaining human even when powerful forces seek to reduce us to instruments. The women who walked out of places like the villa near Berchtesgaden, who reclaimed their names and rebuilt their lives, demonstrated this resistance. They were not always whole. Trauma leaves permanent marks, but they were themselves again, more or less, enough to continue living as the people they had been before rooms and handlers and leather-bound notebooks tried to transform them into something else. Their survival is testament to the resilience of human identity, to the stubborn persistence of the self even in the face of systematic psychological warfare. And their names, Mathilde, Elisabeth, Marie, and all the others whose stories remain buried in classified files, are the evidence that they won in the end. Not the war, not the intelligence conflict, not the immediate struggle against their conditioning, but the longer battle to remain themselves, to refuse the identity that was imposed on them, to insist that they were not subjects or assets or instruments, but human beings with the right to name themselves. That right, so fundamental that we rarely think about it, was what the conditioning programs attacked. And that right, reclaimed by survivors after liberation, is what ensures that the techniques used against them did not ultimately succeed. They forgot their names, yes, but they remembered them again. And in that remembering, they defeated the handlers who believed human identity could be permanently controlled through psychological domination.